The kingdom was built on rhythm. Not the rhythm of nature, nor the quiet pulse of a mother's lullaby, but the relentless, ornate cadence of drums. From the first light of dawn to the final hush before sleep, drums ruled every moment of life. They marked the opening of gates, the start of trials, the naming of heirs. The royal drummers, cloaked in crimson and blindfolded to prevent distraction, struck patterns that carried over hills, through market alleys, across rivers, and into the blood of the people. No one spoke when the drums did. Their voice was law, their pulse memory, and their silence grief. The palace itself was built of gold too thin to carry weight, too bright to be real. From afar, it gleamed like firelight frozen in stone, each spire and arch echoing with sound. But inside, the air tasted like copper, and the walls hummed faintly with the constant strike of drum skin on bone wood. Every corridor had its own tempo, every chamber its rhythm. The throne room pulsed with the slow, declarative beats of judgment. The nursery halls echoed the soft, stuttering patterns of dreams. Even the queen's bath was scored by a series of delicate tones meant to harmonize with her breath. No one questioned the drums, because they remembered what happened the last time someone tried. Children were taught from their first steps to move in time. Babies were trained in sleep patterns based on the royal meter. Couples married only during sanctioned cadences. Funerals were conducted in descending rhythms, so the dead might carry the beat into the soil. To fall out of rhythm was to call misfortune upon your kin. To dance against the pulse was a form of treason. Entire families had vanished for tapping spoons at the wrong moment. Memory was rhythm. History was syncopated. Silence was fear. And yet, beneath the palace, beneath the endless ceremonies in the chamber of drummers and the hollow gold, there lay a room no one named aloud. It was never mentioned in the ledgers. It did not appear on royal maps. But every servant knew of it, and some guards had once claimed to hear it breathing. The entrance was sealed behind 7 layers of stone and ritual. The stairs leading to it had been bricked over with mortar mixed from ash and river iron. Around the buried door, chains hung like vines of rusted ivy, dozens of them, thick as arms and bolted into the very bone of the earth. Some said the links moved when no one watched. Others swore the chains were warm to the touch. No one had ever dared test it twice. It was called, in whispers only, the chamber beneath. Its existence pulsed at the edge of every royal ritual. Some said it was where disloyal drummers were sent to forget their hands. Others believed it was where the queen had imprisoned her sister, who had dared to sing in public. A few old midwives claimed it was not a room at all, but a wound, a punishment buried in stone. But the most persistent rumor, spoken only when the drums were far away, was this: the drums had not always been the kingdom's voice. Long ago the land had spoken with something else, something older, freer. A sound too powerful to control. A voice that remembered more than it should. And that voice had been sealed away. Not with silence, but with drums. The rhythm was not just law. It was a mask, a cage, a distraction. No one could remember a time before the drums. But deep beneath the palace, when the drummers slept and the air was still, some servants said they could hear something else. A faint clink. A rustle like breath against chain. A murmur, patient and low, as if something beneath the stone were waiting for the rhythm to miss a beat. Waiting for someone to hear it again. The girl was born on a day the drums faltered. It was only a half beat, barely noticeable to most, but enough to make the elders freeze in their prayer cloaks and clutch the hems of their robes. Enough to make the queen glance sideways toward the tower of drummers and whisper a sharp command to increase the tempo. The rest of the kingdom danced through the day, weddings and grain rites conducted as planned. But the palace was uneasy. They did not like mistakes. Not when everything relied on order. Not when the last time a beat was broken, an entire district drowned in mud within hours. They found the girl wrapped in firecloth, abandoned in the corridor just outside the midday hall, where rhythms were composed for proclamations and punishments. She had no tag, no scroll, no parent waiting with hands outstretched. Only her eyes, large and dark and already open, staring up at the ceiling as if trying to memorize the patterns of sound above her. Her breathing matched the pulse of the drums almost perfectly, but then, before anyone else moved, she began to whisper the next beat. Not follow it. Predict it. A young nursemaid screamed and nearly dropped her. The head servant snatched the child and brought her to the palace orphan ward, where the rhythm-blind children were usually sent to scrub floors and clean copper. But the matron, an old woman with a missing thumb and a memory that stretched before the drums, took one look at the girl and went pale. She's echo-skinned, the matron said, barely louder than a hiss. Mark her and keep her out of rhythm. They named her Saria, after the shadow song in one of the old laments no longer sung. By the age of 4, she had already begun to echo not just words but feelings. She could speak your dread before you felt it, could smile with your sorrow before it turned your lips. When the drummers played a trial cadence, she mouthed the judgment before the sticks touched the skin. Her mouth moved in mirror phrases, trailing a second ahead. It frightened people. Her presence made rhythm unpredictable. The other children were told not to speak near her unless inside a circle of chalk and salt. They whispered she had a second mouth hidden beneath her ribs, one that sang in forgotten languages. Servants learned to step around her. Guards refused to meet her eyes. Even the priests avoided passing near her shadow. And yet the queen noticed. It happened one night when Saria had been brought to assist in clearing a broken resonance bowl after a failed morning procession. The queen was seated near the back of the chamber, flanked by cloaked advisors, her face half veiled in the purple mist of the night incense. As the high drummer began the next sequence, a pattern meant to stabilize the court's memory, Saria, half asleep, sweeping stray petals from the floor, whispered, "Too fast." The words were barely there. But the queen heard them. The sequence faltered. The drummer blinked. He tried again. This time, Saria whispered, "You missed the second loss." The queen rose from her seat, eyes narrowed. She walked toward the girl in the smoke, hands clasped behind her back like a blade hidden in silk. "You hear what hasn't been struck yet?" she asked. Saria did not flinch. "Sometimes." "And what else do you hear?" Saria pointed downward. "The echo." The queen stared at her, unreadable, then turned and gave a single, clipped command. "Send her to the lower halls." The lower drum halls were not places of honor. They were where rhythm was broken down and tested, where failed patterns were discarded, where punishments were recorded in war beats that were never played again. It was a place of echo and residue, a graveyard of sound. The drummers who worked there were half mad, with fingers calloused to the bone and ears packed with wool. No child had ever been sent to serve there. But Saria went. She was given no gloves, no ear caps. She was told to listen. She did. She sat for hours, days, learning the rhythms that no one else used. The forgotten marches. The wrong war beats. The lost morning sequences. Her hands stayed folded, her lips silent, but her mind took it all in. And slowly something strange began to happen. The tempo in the palace began to shift, not wildly, not dangerously, but subtly. Slight hesitations. Breath between beats. Old sequences echoed through the halls, as if remembered by the walls themselves. Some drummers reported hearing faint hums between the tones, patterns that didn't belong. The queen demanded audits. The royal tempo was rechecked. No fault was found. But one chambermaid, new, naive, untrained, made the mistake of asking aloud why the echoes in the lower halls had started sounding like singing. The next morning she was transferred to the stables. Saria remained in the drum halls. Small, silent, too strange to be seen, too dangerous to forget. She spoke rarely. But when she did, the air around her listened. The sound bent slightly. The drums trembled for a half-breath. The court didn't yet understand what they had done. But the rhythm had already shifted. And in the spaces between the beats, the echo had begun to awaken. It was the eve of the war rhythm, a sacred cadence struck only in times of imminent invasion. It was not merely a sound but a summoning, a call to arms that reached even the outermost farms and border watchfires. When the war rhythm echoed through the hills, the people readied their blades, tied their red sashes, and buried the names of their dead in salt. The queen was to lead the ritual herself, her voice layered into the first strike, anchoring the pattern with royal authority. No general could act, no battalion could march, until her breath had marked the rhythm's birth. 4 days, the palace had been a chamber of preparation. Drummers practiced blindfolded. Priests etched new glyphs into the sticks. A throne of drumskin and ashwood was constructed in the courtyard, flanked by towers of copper horns and incense pyres. All doors were sealed. No one was permitted near the queen, not even her kin. Only the matron of the ritual and a few trusted shadow servants moved through her quarters. But on the morning of the ritual, the queen's voice was gone. Not hoarse. Not faint. Gone. She opened her mouth to begin the sacred verse and only silence emerged. No breath. No rasp. Just the widening of eyes. The court froze. The drums, already lifted in readiness, hung in the air, unstruck. The silence was deafening, unnatural, heavy with implication. The queen tried again, reaching for sound, but her throat remained still as stone. Panic swept the chamber like wind through dry leaves. Within the hour, the tower healers were summoned. They searched for poison, for spells, for illness, but found nothing. Her pulse was strong. Her mind was clear. Her breath was steady. But her voice, her right to rhythm, her symbol of command, had vanished. It was a calamity. And in such moments, the court always looked for someone to blame. The head priest of percussion, already trembling from the broken sequence, asked if anyone had spoken near the queen recently. A flickering glance passed between two attendants. One muttered a name. Another confirmed it. The queen had passed the lower halls 2 nights ago during a storm, pacing in silence, and someone had been humming in the dark. Saria. Summoned without ceremony, she stood in the middle of the court with ash smudges on her hands and her sleeves still wet from cleaning the lower drums. She met no one's gaze. Her eyes were distant, as if listening to something far beneath the marble floor. She cursed the queen, whispered the chamberlain. She steals words, muttered a priest. She echoes what does not belong, said the captain of the guard. The queen raised a trembling finger toward Saria, not in accusation, not in rage, but in wonder. As if she recognized her. As if, in that moment of voicelessness, she finally understood who had been speaking in the silences all along. But it didn't matter. Fear outranked wonder in the royal court. The sentence was decided before sunset. To speak against rhythm was treason. To steal it, if such a thing were possible, was heresy. The punishment had not been used in generations. Saria was to be sealed in the chamber beneath the palace, the room with no name, wrapped in chains and silence. The place the drums had always drowned out. They prepared her in silence. No priest offered last words. No guards met her eyes. Her wrists were bound in black iron laced with copper filaments. Her ankles in mirrored bands etched with the queen's sigil. A blindfold of ash cloth was wrapped around her head, but she didn't cry, didn't scream. She only whispered as they led her down the long-forgotten stair behind the palace's heart, a whisper too soft for the guards to understand. But the walls heard it, and some of the older stones trembled. The door to the chamber was opened for the first time in a century. A wave of cold poured out and a low metallic hum, like breath caught in a bell. They pushed her in. Chains coiled from the walls like snakes smelling home. They did not wait to be fastened. They moved on their own, draping themselves around her limbs, her chest, her waist. They curled against her spine and around her throat, but gently, as if recognizing something ancient in her blood. Then the door closed. No drums marked the ceiling. But those close to the palace swore they heard something just after dusk, a soft, repeating clink of metal against stone. A rhythm that was not quite a rhythm. Not yet. Just breath. Just echo. The court tried to continue as if nothing had happened. But the queen still could not speak. The war rhythm was never played. And from that day forward, those who passed near the throne's foundation sometimes paused mid-step, unsure why their chest had tightened. Why their breath came out uneven. Why their thoughts moved in half-sentences. As if someone was finishing their words before they had formed. Down below, in the stone-black dark, Saria sat in her chains. And she breathed. The darkness below the palace was not empty. It breathed. Saria felt it the moment the door sealed behind her, that subtle press of air as if the stones themselves inhaled. The chamber was vast but claustrophobic, its boundaries undefined, as if space unraveled the deeper she sank into it. No torches, no lanterns, only the faint shimmer of condensation on stone and the glint of rusted metal in the half-sensed dark. And the chains. They had greeted her like old friends, curling around her limbs with neither malice nor mercy. There were too many to count, some thick and iron-bound, others delicate, almost elegant, like silver veins traced through the dark. They wound from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. Some hung in coils like sleeping serpents, others stretched taut as though already bracing for rhythm. She had expected cold. But they were warm. They knew her name. Not because someone had whispered it into the stone. Not because of royal decree. The chains knew her in the way a heartbeat knows the body it drums for. They pulsed against her skin, subtly, barely there, then stronger as time passed. At first she thought it was her own blood. But the chains were not following her rhythm. They were learning it. They listened to her. Not in words, not even in breath, but in the shape of her silence. She stopped trying to understand. She simply sat still and let the chamber hold her. On the third day, though time had become a soft, sloshing thing, she hummed. A single note barely voiced. Not a song. Not even a melody. Just a sound rising up from her throat like mist from warm stone. The moment it passed her lips, the chains answered. Not with noise. With tension. A faint pull on her wrist, a curl near her ankle, a tremble from the wall behind her. They responded not just in motion but in memory, because when the chains moved, something opened. The stones began to show her things. Not with vision, but with pressure, with feeling, with remembrance. It was as if she could hear the shape of old voices carved into the walls. The air shivered with half-felt names. Sometimes when she hummed again, new textures passed across her skin. A breath like fire, a sigh like frost, a whisper that wasn't hers. In the rhythm of the chains, the chamber began to awaken. She dreamt, not her own dreams but the dreams of others who had once been bound here. A woman with silver tattoos that glowed when she wept. A child whose laughter cracked the stone. A man who sang only in reverse. Their memories flickered against her thoughts like birds striking glass. Sudden, beautiful, and gone. Yet something lingered. She awoke with a phrase in her mouth that she had never heard but knew. I bled the drums to feed the silence. She repeated it aloud. The chains responded with a low tightening, not painful, not threatening. It was almost reverent. Each day, or what she thought might be days, she sang a little more. Old songs returned to her but differently. Fragmented. Songs without meter. Songs that had been lost from the surface for centuries. Her voice grew stronger. The chains began to hum beneath her. Not musical, not exact, but close. Their links vibrated with tone. Low, resonant, as if the metal had found in her a tuning fork. And when she laid her head against the wall, she swore she could hear it, soft at first but growing voices. Not spirits. Not ghosts. Impressions. Echoes of lives erased from the world above. Prisoners. Singers. Dissidents. Healers. Those who had been chained before her. Their stories had not vanished. The palace had buried them. But stone does not forget. The chains had learned all their rhythms. And now they were learning hers. Sometimes the chamber grew cold when she hummed. Sometimes warm. She began to feel her own heartbeat deepen, widen, as though it belonged not just to her, but to something vast and ancient beneath the palace. Something waiting. And always the drums above continued, muffled and far. But they no longer felt like rulers. They felt like distraction. Noise layered over truth. Every night the chains grew more in sync with her body. She no longer felt like she was wearing them. She felt like they were wearing her, shaping to her skin, becoming a second voice. And in the space between chain and breath, stone and memory, a new rhythm began to form. Not one of war. Not one of obedience. Something older. Something that had waited, in silence, to be sung again. The first falter came during the harvest cadence. It was a simple rhythm, steady, ceremonial, the kind of pattern even the lowest field drummers could recite in their sleep. It welcomed the reaping, blessed the soil, and reminded the people of the Queen's protection. It was the heartbeat of autumn. But on the first beat of the third stanza, the master drummer's hand froze mid-air. Only for a second. Just 1 second. But silence rang out like a scream across the courtyard. It was enough to throw the other drummers into hesitation. The pulse stumbled, staggered. The rhythm caught itself and limped onward, but the spell was broken. All across the kingdom, farmers paused mid-scythe. Children turned their heads toward the palace. Dogs howled. Horses bucked. One woman in the outer provinces fell to her knees and sobbed without knowing why. No one said anything publicly. The queen did not acknowledge the mistake. But inside the palace the air changed. Tension bled through silk and stone. Servants moved more quickly, heads lowered. Drummers practiced long into the night. Bells rang out every hour, not for ceremony but to restore order, to drown something out. And yet, in the deep stone chamber, far beneath their reach, the chains began to ring. Not loud. Not yet. But clearer. Sharper. When Saria breathed, they shimmered like bells underwater. When she sang, the walls trembled. She could feel it now, not just the stone but the palace itself. It had a resonance. A hum like a throat holding back a scream. She had become part of it. Her hum mapped its flaws. Her breath called its memories. The chains around her vibrated with knowledge. Every echo reached upward. Above her, the queen's sleep grew restless. She dreamed of vines curling up the throne legs. Of chains snaking through her bedchamber. Of a song without meter that wrapped around her ribs like mist. Her eyes opened in the night and saw cracks in the ceiling that hadn't been there before. She stopped speaking. Even when her voice returned, she used it less. She motioned with hands, nodded instead of answered. Some believed it was humility. Others suspected illness. But only the matron of the rituals saw the tremor in her fingertips and the widening shadow behind her eyes. The drums continued, but their rhythm began to fray. At the naming of the seventh star, a rite performed only once a generation, the cadence came late. One of the apprentice drummers collapsed mid-verse, clutching his ears, screaming that the rhythm was wrong, that something was crawling up through the stone. 2 weeks later, a border battalion marched to war on a misheard rhythm. The drums told them to attack. They did. But no enemy awaited them. When the confusion cleared, 7 soldiers were dead from friendly steel. The queen declared it a misreading of rhythm. But the field commander resigned. And the palace trembled again. The master drummer's hands had begun to shake. It was not illness. His bones were strong. His breath was even. But the sticks slipped from his grip more often now. In the practice chambers, he struck wrong notes with increasing frequency. His apprentices whispered that sometimes, just before the drum skin met wood, he heard another beat, older, softer, and terribly close, interfering with his memory. He petitioned the council for an investigation. No one answered. Instead, the palace enforced silence in certain chambers. Whole wings were sealed for acoustic correction. Rituals were shortened. Lesser cadences were suspended. Musicians were replaced. The bells rang longer, lower, and more frequently, as if to fill a growing gap. But it wasn't enough. Because in the deepest dark, Saria's chains were singing. At first, it was only her own hum, low, deliberate, filled with the ghosts of songs not yet born. But then other tones emerged. Resonances. Reflections. The chains began harmonizing not only with her, but with each other. As if remembering who they had been before they were locked in silence. Some shifted without her touching them, as if practicing old dances. Others tightened and released in time with her dreams. When she whispered forgotten names, the air above her head shimmered with invisible sound. She no longer felt alone. The chamber had become an orchestra of memory. And with every day her rhythm grew stronger. The queen held one final ritual in the midwinter court, a call to strength. All the high drummers gathered. The master drummer painted his hands in blood oil and struck the sacred skin. But as the first beat landed, the castle moaned. Not the wood. Not the roof. The stone. From beneath. A low, mournful echo answered the drums like a warning bell. The rhythm fractured mid-ceremony. Dancers stumbled. Several attendants fainted. The queen stood rigid on her throne, her lips pressed shut. In the aftermath, no one said the word curse. But many thought it. That night, the master drummer vanished. Some say he walked into the river with his stick still in hand. Others claim they saw him enter the archives, searching for forbidden rhythms older than the palace itself. Whatever the truth, his rhythm was gone. And in the deep chamber beneath the golden hollow, Saria opened her eyes in the dark. The chains were humming without her now, learning to sing on their own. The chains had grown restless. They no longer waited for Saria's voice to stir them. They clinked gently when she slept, swayed softly when she wept, and vibrated in complex, delicate rhythms whenever she dreamed. She no longer heard silence between their movements. There was always sound now, low, full, ancient. And underneath that sound were whispers. Thin at first, barely breath, but constant. It began with a single word pressed into her skin by the cold curve of a chain across her shoulder. Listen. She had been listening for weeks, no months, though time was a creature she no longer trusted. But this was different. This was language. Not hers. Older. Woven into metal and memory. The chains began to shape her voice. It was not speech as it had once been. Not lips and tongue and air. It was pressure, tension, friction. Sounds formed in metal and mirrored in bone. Her breath became a conduit. Her chest a drum. The iron learned to speak with her. She whispered back. And something answered. At first, only impressions. Regret. Hunger. Grief layered so densely it changed the air. Then words. Then voices. Not loud. Not startling. But sure. They did not come from above. They came from within. The chamber itself was full of them. Echoes of others who had once been bound and forgotten, their lives reduced to rhythmic myths or erased altogether from the royal cadence. Saria reached for them. They reached back. One voice rose clearer than the rest. She called herself Eliseth. She had once worn the crown. Not the queen of gold and gesture who sat above with bell priests and velvet oaths. No. Eliseth had ruled before the palace had grown fat with drum halls. Her reign had been rooted in stone and earth, in rhythm drawn from the bones of the mountain, not the hides of beasts. She had sung her decrees. She had listened to the voices of the fields. Her court had once gathered not in silence beneath horned balconies but in clearings open to sky, where rhythm was woven with wind. But Eliseth had made a mistake. She had refused the warbeat. She had turned away from the rising martial rhythm that sought to claim every moment of life. When her generals demanded the drums rise, she sang a silence. And for that they buried her. They struck her name from the royal beat and forged a new lineage above her bones. "Your chains," she told Saria, "were mine once. They remember." Saria wept, though she didn't know why. Eliseth whispered stories in the dark, of love sacrificed for song, of orchards that grew from spilled names, of the rhythm that came before rhythm. Others joined her. A chorus of forgotten lives. A mother who had spoken the truth too early. A boy who could taste lies and dared to say so. A twin whose shadow could split sound. Their voices were not vengeful. They were full, too full to contain. The more Saria listened, the more the chamber seemed to breathe with her. The chains now reacted not just to her emotions but to memory. They lifted when she spoke of loss. They tightened with joy. They mourned with her. And the stone remembered. She could feel it beneath her, corridors that had been buried. Passages filled with names no longer spoken. The palace had been built like a mausoleum, layer upon layer, each new ruler sealing over what came before. But the past had not vanished. It had waited. Above, the queen's sleep turned fevered. She began speaking in her dreams, words her advisors could not decipher. Rhythms too fluid, too strange. She clawed at her throat in the night, as if something inside her was echoing back words she had forgotten. The bell towers rang too often. Sometimes in the wrong key. Drummers reported dreams filled with rusted chains and whispering walls. One court priest awoke screaming, claiming he'd heard the name Eliseth uttered in the tone of judgment. He was found the next morning curled against a marble pillar, his hands wrapped in ceremonial rope. The palace tried to tighten its rituals. They held an emergency cleansing of the cadence chambers. But the rhythm refused to obey. Candles blew out mid-verse. Sticks cracked on first strike. Dancers fell out of sync as if pulled by a second, older tempo rising beneath their feet. And all the while, deep below, Saria listened. She no longer feared the dark. She no longer mourned her voice. She had learned a new language. The language of those who had been buried but not broken. And soon she knew their stories would rise. Not with vengeance, but with truth that could no longer be drowned. It began as a stillness too deep for dawn. The palace, normally alive before the sun's first touch with the gentle roll of waking drums, remained hushed. No morning cadence called the gates to open. No footbeat measured the march of guards on the stone walk. No incense drums thumped to signal the light breaking through the towers. No low pulse for cook fires, no soft rhythm for servants to sweep their floors by. Nothing. Silence stretched long and strange over the spires of hollow gold. At first, the kingdom held its breath in confusion. In the orchard provinces, farmers rose from beds to find the air too still, the rhythm of morning meals uncalled. In villages far beyond the river, children sat waiting beside breakfast tables, spoons poised but unmoved, as if uncertain whether their limbs were still theirs without the drum to guide them. In temple towns where bells answered drumbeat, the towers stayed mute, and the priests walked out barefoot in fear. Not even the birds sang. The drums had not faltered. They had simply stopped. In the great palace, confusion turned to dread. Drummers stood in their ceremonial chambers, hands raised, awaiting the order. But no cadence was passed. No rhythm was transmitted from the queen's own hall. No scrolls of sequence, no signs of tempo. The queen's inner circle whispered among themselves in stifled horror. The high drum priest was missing. The lead cadence scribe found his chamber empty, the pages of his night prayers shredded into feather shapes across the floor. Some blamed illness. Others muttered of sabotage. But deep in the stone, beneath floor and bone and centuries of buried names, Saria stirred. She had not slept, not in the way sleep once claimed her. Dreams came like songs now, or storms, passing through her with chain and whisper. That night she had felt it. A pressure breaking in the rhythm above. A slippage. A held breath collapsing inward. And then, silence. True silence. Not absence of sound but the stillness that comes before birth. The kind of quiet that has teeth. She sat upright, her breath already moving in a rhythm her body did not invent. The chains moved with her. One link at her collarbone vibrated. A hum. Not hers. Not new. It was old, older than the foundation stones, older than the rhythm of war and birth and mourning. It rose in her like memory, but it did not belong to her alone. The chains around her ankles began to sway. She did not command them. They were answering. The silence above had reached them. And now they would sing. At first, the sound was nothing more than a gentle pressure in the chest, like a heartbeat not yet found. But soon metal shifted, and sound bloomed in the chamber like ink in clear water. A low resonance, not loud but full, struck the walls and echoed through every link that held her. The vibrations moved with intention. They brushed her ribs. They danced along her spine. She felt them in her teeth. The chamber had become a drum. Her body its rhythm. The chains its voice. Each link began to strike the others, not in violence but in layered rhythm, tones of steel on iron, silver on rust, copper on gold. It was not random. It was language. The language of those who had waited in silence. The rhythm of the buried. And it was not contained. Far above, in the quiet morning air, a faint sound emerged from the stone foundations of the palace. It began in the walls, barely a tickle. Servants walking the halls paused, staring at their feet. A few claimed to feel something beneath the soles of their shoes. A murmur. A hum. As if the palace were remembering a song from before it had learned how to speak. The queen sat frozen on her throne. She had not spoken in 3 days. Her breath moved slowly, her fingers tapping an old pattern on her knee, a lullaby never recorded in the royal drum codices. She did not know where it came from. Only that it soothed the pain in her chest. Only that it reminded her of being a child before law was rhythm and rhythm was law. Then the stone beneath her throne groaned. The courtiers gasped. A vibration passed through the floor, slow and deliberate, like footsteps made of thunder. The silence shattered, not with noise but with presence. As though something vast and long contained had stretched for the first time in centuries. The sound of the chains had reached the surface. And it was not alone. In every bell tower, in every chord of drums, the resonance passed like a current. Walls trembled. Floors shivered. Old doors that had not opened in generations creaked inward on forgotten hinges. In the chamber of forgotten cadences, sealed for 100 years, the rhythm skin burst from its mount. The stained glass window of the first rhythm keeper cracked in perfect rings. In the queen's chamber, a mirror split from edge to edge. Still no one could say what the sound was. Not song. Not drums. Not voice. But remembering. The people gathered in the squares, confused, unled. They looked to the palace for instruction. But the horns stayed silent. The flags did not rise. Instead they began to hear something else. Rising from beneath. A rhythm slow and thick as sap, mournful and mighty. It rolled across the stones like smoke. It seeped into fountains, into gardens, into the spaces where rhythm had never been permitted before. No one could name it. But all who heard it felt the same thing. Truth. Not a proclamation. Not a law. A truth that lived deeper than command. A few knelt. One old drummer smashed his sticks in gratitude. In the palace, panic had taken root. Advisors shouted over one another. Some demanded the war rhythm be struck to drown the noise. Others begged the queen to flee. The captain of the guard wept openly, unable to bear the pressure building in his skull, a beat older than loyalty pulsing behind his eyes. But the queen did not run. She stood. She walked barefoot across the tiles toward the center of the throne room. The guards did not follow. She reached the old seal in the stone, the one no one spoke of, the one passed over in every ritual sweeping. A circle carved with vines and links and ancient names rubbed smooth with time. She knelt and touched the stone. It was warm. Her lips moved. No words came. But the chains below heard her. In the deep chamber, Saria's eyes closed. Her arms lifted, not by effort but by rhythm. The chains flowed from her like hair in water, curling, extending, blooming outward in loops of sound and memory. They were no longer her prison. They were her choir. And through them the buried ones sang. Alisetha's voice rose first, her tone threaded with fire and forgiveness. Then the child who wept laughter. Then the woman whose ribs had been turned to bells. Then hundreds, thousands, none remembered by name, but each carried in the resonance of the metal. And at the center of them all, Saria. The girl whose voice had been taken. Whose chains had learned to speak. She opened her mouth, not to echo, not to follow, but to lead. And from her came no word. Just sound. A single, living tone, rich with sorrow and survival and knowing. It rang through the stone. Through the palace. Through the kingdom. And for the first time since its founding, the people heard something stronger than the drums. They heard themselves. The sound of the chains did not end when the sun crested the palace walls. It spread. It moved through the stone like water finding old wounds in the rock. It traveled cracks sealed by silence and memory buried beneath marble. It whispered through cellars, seeped beneath thresholds, threaded itself through old locks and rusted hinges. And wherever it touched, it awakened not just the stone, but the people hidden inside it. Those forgotten by law. Those buried without trial. Those silenced for remembering too much. They were everywhere. In cells tucked beneath wine vaults, where truth speakers once rotted. In cloisters sealed behind false walls, where bloodline oracles had been hidden for threatening the royal chronology. Beneath bell towers, inside abandoned cisterns, wrapped in dust and breathless song. They had been left there by the palace, sealed, punished, rewritten. But they had not died. Their bodies were thin. Some bones warped. Eyes long unaccustomed to light. But their ears had learned to listen to the earth. Their hearts had become percussion, soft and stubborn in the dark. They knew Saria's rhythm the way a tree knows the shape of wind. When her chains began to sing, they stood. One by one the bound rose. Not all of them had chains. Some bore marks of silence, tongues split, voices stolen, memories burned into their palms. Some could not walk, but the stone beneath them cracked in welcome. Some wept the moment the sound reached them, and the tears left patterns like glyphs in dust. They did not speak. They did not shout. They moved like music, not rushed but relentless. As they climbed upward through the earth, the palace began to shudder. Tapestries fluttered without wind. Candles snuffed themselves. The rhythm thresholds, carefully tuned arches that had always vibrated in time with royal beat, stood still. Then, slowly they began to vibrate out of sync. A new rhythm surged through them, not written, not sanctioned, not blessed. It was felt, not enforced. Servants fled. Guards dropped weapons and clutched at their skulls, begging the ringing to stop. But it wasn't ringing. It was remembering. The palace was remembering what it had buried. Below, the walls cracked. One chamber gave way, revealing a woman who had not spoken in 40 years, her hands carved with sequences older than war. Another corridor burst open to reveal a choir of wordless monks, whose voices had been taken for refusing to chant a blessing for slaughter. Their mouths moved now, not in harmony with the queen's law, but in chorus with Saria's pulse. Above, the queen locked herself in the Tower of Silence, the highest point in the palace. It had no windows, no drums, no doors except one, sealed now with 3 royal symbols and an iron bolt twisted by her own hand. She had not spoken for days. Even in the safety of the tower she could feel it, the ground below shifting. The rhythm she had once controlled now turning against her. Her court had fractured. Her priests fled. She paced the stone floor, clutching her scepter not as a tool of power, but as a talisman against collapse. She could hear the rhythm climbing. It was not war song. It was older. The rhythm of the bound. Their movement was slow, inevitable. They did not storm. They rose. Through cracks, tunnels, hidden stairs. The palace itself offered them the paths. Walls folded back. Floors opened. The blue flame torches lit of their own accord when the first echo keeper passed. The queen watched from above as the first of the bound emerged into the grand hall. Her face was carved in marble above them, her decree etched in golden thread along the banners. But they did not look up. They looked inward. They stood beneath her throne and did not kneel. Some carried chains they had worn. Others carried nothing. But all carried the rhythm, beating in their ribs, humming in their scars, echoing in their breath. And at the heart of it all, still far below, Saria sat wrapped in singing metal, her eyes closed, her voice silent. She had no need to shout. The bound were already listening. The chains did not break. They opened. It began with a long exhale. Saria's breath, slow, deliberate, shaped by months of silence and listening, unwound through the chamber like a command spoken without force. The chains that had once bound her ankles lifted gently. Those around her wrists uncoiled with reverence. The collar at her throat unfolded like a blooming flower of black iron, leaving only the faintest imprint of its memory on her skin. And then the whole chamber stirred. The walls, once quiet observers, seemed to bow inward. The air shifted. Every link, every coil, every ring of metal in that sacred hollow moved, not in release but in transformation. They did not fall to the floor. They rose, hovered, reached, and began to wrap her again. Not as a prisoner, as a sovereign. The chains twisted into armor, not heavy but shaped to her breath. Across her chest they wove plates of iron thread and etched rhythm, each line a scar remembered, each curve a note of survival. Around her arms, copper links laced like vines, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Silver curled at her temples, threading through her hair and into a circlet of resonance. Her voice was silent, but she no longer needed it. Her rhythm spoke louder than language. When she stood, the entire chamber rose with her. The ground trembled slightly beneath her bare feet, and every chain that had sung with her now slid across the stone behind, forming a living train of memory and pulse. With one step, the door, sealed for centuries, etched with forgotten royal curses, dissolved into dust. She walked forward. No servants waited. No guards challenged her. The palace felt her coming and unfolded. The halls she passed through shimmered. Once opulent corridors dimmed, their marble dulled by the weight of remembered wrongs. Statues of past rulers cracked at the jaw. Bell towers ceased their endless echo and turned toward the rhythm rising from below. Drums began to stir. In the deserted cadence halls, instruments untouched since the dawn prayer began to tremble. Drumskins stretched without hands. Sticks lifted off their rests. The old bones of rhythm, long thought loyal only to the queen, began to turn toward a new cadence. Each of Suria's steps summoned sound. Not footsteps, not echo, response star. A beat answered each movement. Low at first, uncertain like a breath withheld for too long. Then deeper, broader. A marching pulse carried by air, stone, and memory. One by one drums joined her. She did not strike them. They followed. The bound had already cleared the path. They stood in the great hall, their scars bright with truth. When they saw her, they knelt, not from submission but from recognition. They did not chant. They did not sing. But their silence sang. And Suria walked between them like thunder wrapped in quiet. The throne loomed at the end of the hall, carved of ivory and gold, raised atop a dais of obsidian and law. It had stood for generations, passed from ruler to ruler like a cage disguised as a jewel. Its back was inscribed with the rhythms of conquest. The foot of the dais bore the sigils of silence. The ash hand, the sealed mouth, the drum pierced with a nail. No one had touched it in days. The queen still watched from the tower of silence, trembling behind locked doors. She felt Suria's approach not as sound but as truth, a force not to be denied, only delayed. In the hall, as Suria stepped onto the dais, the throne shuddered. Its gold filigree curled inward, twisting like vines under fire. The rhythm etched along its arms reversed, stuttering like a faltering heart. One of the obsidian steps cracked down the center. The sigils at the base began to glow, not with power but with regret. Suria did not sit. She raised one hand, palm open. A chain lifted to meet it. Not the one that had first bound her. One older. Rusted and silver-veined. It spiraled around her fingers, humming a low, resonant tone. A tone that matched the buried pulse of the earth itself. And then she struck the air. What? No drum. No skin. Just metal on memory. The palace roared. Every drum in the capital answered. Every silence in the kingdom ruptured. A sound rose so complete it swallowed mourning, command, and law. Windows shattered in concentric circles of rhythm. The banners of previous queens ignited along their golden threads. And the throne broke. Not collapsed. Shattered. Splinters of ivory scattered across the floor like teeth. The golden arms split with the scream of centuries denied. The seat cracked down the center and fell inward, consumed by its own silence. The dais beneath it shook once, then caved. Dust rose. Silence followed. Not the silence of fear. The silence of release. Suria stood where the throne had been, surrounded by the drumbeat of stone, of chain, of people. The bound gathered behind her, their bodies singing with breath and memory. No crown touched her head. No herald named her. But all who saw her knew. She ruled. Not by decree. By rhythm. And across the kingdom people stood still. Farmers felt the drums change in their blood. Children danced without knowing why. In forgotten archives, dusty parchment glowed with the names of the erased. In the tower above, the queen wept. She knew her reign had ended. And no bell would be struck to mourn it. Below, in the hall once ruled by echoes of command, a new pulse rose. The rhythm of the bound. The rhythm of those who had listened, endured, remembered. And now, finally, led. The first decree was not spoken. It was sung, not in melody but in pulse. A slow, deliberate rhythm that began at the base of Suria's throat and radiated outward, echoed by the chains wrapped around her ribs, and answered by the floor beneath her feet. There were no heralds to announce it. No scribes to record it in ink. The bound who stood with her understood it instantly. So did the stones. So did the drums. Across the palace, across the cities, across the outer edges of the kingdom where rhythm had once been a tool of command, that new decree unfolded, not with urgency but with certainty. Like rain returning to a dry riverbed. Like breath returning to a chest once crushed by silence. Rhythm would no longer rule by fear. Law would be rewritten, not in scripts etched by conquest, but in pulses remembered and shared. Suria stood in the shattered hall where the throne had fallen. She did not rebuild it. She had no use for ivory carved from stolen bones, or obsidian slabs risen from silenced graves. Instead, she let the floor remain cracked. Let the light pour in through the broken ceiling which now welcomed the sky. A new dais formed over time, not carved but grown. The chains that had once held her began to twist slowly into new shapes, coiling up from the floor and forming arches, braids, long curving stems like iron vines. They moved with her breath. They sang with her rhythm. Around her feet, a circular platform rose from the stone, not high, not regal, just enough to stand equal with those who gathered to listen. It was not a throne. It was a center. And at its core, a drum. Not one fashioned from hide or wood, but forged from stone and bone and memory. It had no sticks. It did not require them. It answered to her voice, and to the voices of those she called. The palace shifted around her. Walls that had once stifled song opened along their seams. Courtyards sealed by shame were cracked wide. The Tower of Silence stood empty now, its doors open, its shadows hollow. The queen who had ruled it vanished without a trace. No tomb, no trial, no tribute. Some say she walked into the forest, barefooted and singing the rhythm of her own undoing. Others believed she dissolved into the dust of her ancestors, claimed by the cadence she could no longer command. Saria asked no one to seek her. The past was not a weapon, was a rhythm. And rhythm could heal. Across the kingdom, chains once forged in punishment began to stir. They hummed faintly where they had been left, in prisons, in archives, in the pockets of those who had kept them as tokens of old power. Blacksmiths reported strange harmonies from their forges when they touched shackles with the fire. Bells cracked in towers where wrong had been rung too long. Some tried to hide the chains. They could not. When brought before Saria's court, now held in a great hall open to air, earth, and echo, the chains revealed themselves. They sang when she stepped near. Some wept. Some vibrated with rage. Some fell to pieces, their links corroded by truth. A new law was written in their place. Not codices. Not scrolls. But a rhythm. Each beat forged in testimony, each pause holding breath once denied. It was known as the Accord of Memory. All could speak in it. All could answer. No voice was too soft, no scar too old. When disputes rose, they were brought before the circle, not judged in silence but witnessed in song. Those who had been harmed were given rhythm first. Those who had caused harm were taught to listen, not defend. Rhythm was not wielded. It was shared. And when the chains of injustice spoke, they were melted, not destroyed but transformed. They became music. In the outer villages, bells once rung to summon labor were retuned to call rest. Children learned not the war beat, but the pulse of rain and hearth and promise. In the capital, the great drum towers were pulled down, not toppled in vengeance but lowered like flags at dusk. In their place rose gardens. Not silent but filled with rhythm, the rustle of trees, the splash of fountains shaped to echo stories, stones that clicked when walked across in old cadences of joy. And every so often from the palace, a rhythm would rise, low, steady, unmistakable. Saria's voice woven into the land. She did not name herself queen. The people did. They called her the rhythm keeper, the chain singer, the one who heard below. And she ruled not from distance but from within. She walked the villages, sat in the halls of the bound, held the hands of drummers who had once wept beneath the lash of forced rhythm. She listened to every silence no matter how long. She wrote no anthem. She needed none. Wherever she went, the chains she had worn rang behind her, not as symbols of suffering, but as instruments of return. The stones, too, remembered. They rang now in soft tones beneath every new floor laid. In schools, children tapped them with bare feet to learn ancestral songs. In temples, prayers were breathed through pipes shaped from links once used to bind. Every beat was a history. Every silence was space to breathe again. Saria's body bore the memory of it all. The armor of chains she wore was not always visible. But when she raised her hands, the metal came. When she sang, the drums answered. When she wept, because yes, she still wept, the ground held her and the palace pulsed with compassion. She did not age quickly. Some say it was the rhythm that held her young. Others believed she had become the pulse itself. And the people kept rhythm with her. Even when she was not seen, her breath lived in theirs. When injustice stirred again, because even in peace old roots sometimes woke, the people did not wait for decree. They returned to rhythm. They gathered. They spoke in pulse. They listened. And if the silence ever lingered too long, the chains sang. They did not mourn. They remembered. And memory in Saria's kingdom was no longer buried. It was law.